Hey folks, Steve here with another Fleurus 1794 video, I guess is how I should reference this as I'm going through. This is not going to be the turn one video. I've decided, just because these questions have come up in some of the comments before, and just I know that they're going to come up later, I thought I'd use this time in this video to talk a little bit about how the system plays, like how to play it, not as clean or as pretty as some other how to play videos. There are some from Thursday Night Gamers that can support this, but I think the camera angle in that video makes it really hard to track what's going on. So I'm going to try to hit things at a general high level in the way that the game operates and the way it works, the sequence of play, and kind of how you adjudicate things. And then I'm going to tie that to the overall strategic objectives for both sides in this battle and what they're trying to achieve. So we're going to try to connect the rules to actually, what's the intention of the actions that you're taking during the game to move the football. Now, because I am not playing with the hidden movement stuff, I'm not really going to talk about that too much. I'm going to touch upon it very lightly. I'm also not going to be talking about how the cards come into things. So I am sorry if you want to learn about how the card mechanisms come into play when you choose to play it that way. You will have to wait for either a future video or for someone else to cover that in the specified level of detail that you want. Um, so yeah, that's the objective for this video. If you already know how to play, then maybe the most value in this video will be talking about strategy. That'll probably be in the later half of this video. But if you're a veteran of the system, you may just want to hang back and wait for the turn one video to see the actual coverage, or stick around for the fun of it. And if you're kind of new to the system or you're curious, hopefully this video will at least provide uh, some basic understanding of the way the game should operate. It's really not a terribly complex system. I myself still need to see how I'm going to make it all work together, given the specific constraints of this scenario. The big one to me being in some of the battles from later eras, or later years of this era, I should say, the other games in the series, you tend to have a lot more units. And so formations, units within a formation, but generally just other formations, can better support each other. So, this guy would not have an open flank. He'd maybe have somebody over here as well, another formation. So you'd have this guy and maybe somebody else, and they could all mutually kind of support the advance forward. In this scenario, I guess you would describe it as sparser. It's more sparse in terms of the units. You can certainly have units from within a formation support each other. You can see even just this red formation from the Austrians, you have their light cavalry, which is not currently in vedette form. You have an infantry here. You have their officer leader, another infantry with the artillery, and then in the rear with the overall commander, there is actually a heavy cavalry unit back here. So when you look at that and say, okay, well, here's my formation, and we'll talk about what does a formation even mean here very shortly. You're really just talking about like 5 units on the board, 5 units. So 2 cavalry for that column, an artillery, and then 2 infantry. So it's not a huge amount of force coverage when you start talking about fighting on a front. It's a little blob of forces operating, not shoulder to shoulder with other formations, unless we really choose to like pick a place to have a line of units all connected. And I'm not sure we're going to see that, just due to the way that terrain breaks things up. So definitely going to be an aspect of this where how we play through is ultimately, and even how we strategize what we're going to do, maybe a little bit different than what we might see in some of the other scenarios where the armies are much bigger. There's more units on the board, period. And the coalition has better unit formation capability here. That gets into the special rules of this scenario. We'll talk a little bit more about that as well in here as we go. But it's mostly just stacking stuff. How many units can you stack? Right now, the coalition can really, at best, stack 2 friendly combat units in a hex. I think, period. I think maybe a leader allows them to have a couple more but generally they're going to have restrictions on stacking, where the French don't necessarily have to do that. They can stack more efficiently, which may mean they can put a lot of strength points in a single hex for an attack. Whether or not that really matters, because you're going to be wanting to get flanks, I'm not totally sure about in this particular battle. So a little bit of an intro on what this video is really intended to do. We're going to switch gears over to looking at the sequence of play, and then really walking through kind of, what do you do ultimately on each turn, and how is that supposed to work? Okay, the first thing to understand the way this game works is that each turn represents an hour in a day. There are night turns where you do things a little bit differently, and I may cover night turn mechanics much lighter than I do just the regular turns, because the night turns we're really not going to be dealing with in the scenario that we're playing, but just the general operation. Each game turn is going to be 1 hour, and it's split between the first player turn and the second player turn. And very generally, it's going to be I go, you go, where the first player will, I think, always be the first player, and the second player will always be the second player. In this scenario, the first player is the coalition, so the Austrians will get to go eventually when the Dutch and possibly the British are in. They'll go first in a turn. They'll go through their whole turn segment or turn phase for their player turn, do all their stuff, and then the French will get to go. So this is a bit of, older school model of war game. There's not as much reaction or intervention or interception in this game system. One could certainly imagine, that those could be enhancements to such a system, but I think generally this should work okay. Just keep that in mind if you're used to something. I'm coming off of OCS, and in that game you have whole reaction barrages and reaction movement and attacks and combat within each and every other turn. So it's a lot of interactivity. In this game system, it's going to be a lot of, I'm doing all of my stuff, here's what's going to happen, and then you do all of your stuff. It is a simpler system, obviously, so that is a part of it. So the very first thing we would do in a player turn, especially if it's the first player turn, is we would do weather. In this particular battle, weather doesn't matter, but sometimes what can happen just at a high level is weather can affect things like, what there are potentially die roll modifiers. There's limitations on movement and bombardment in certain things where, rivers may become frozen, and that can affect how they can be traversed. Again, in this battle, nothing that we're really going to worry about, so weather can basically just be ignored. If we were playing with cards, we'd also work on drawing and playing cards, which again we're not going to be doing in this particular playthrough. So now we have the command phase. So the command phase is basically where we're going to determine who's going to be in command, which is going to be important for that units, which units are going to have good movement, who can advance after combat, and all of that sort of thing. So the very first part of this phase would be a supply segment. If we were checking supply, you basically want to make sure that your units can count back to a baggage train, which, just to show, here's one back here, sort of arbitrarily selected for this column, and then that this baggage train is going to be able to trace back along roads to a supply source, which all the coalition units are capable of doing that right now. But it's a good check. I think it's like 14 movement points or something like that from units to their baggage train, and then the baggage train just needs to trace a trunk line on roads and such back to the supply line. Now there's a recovery segment on turns that weather is checked, where units may be able to come back from being eliminated. At the beginning of a scenario, we won't really have that. But as units are eliminated, they come off the board. They are going to end up in some holding boxes over here that they basically have an opportunity to recover, reconstitute themselves, and come back onto the board in a reduced state. We would do that now. I think that's going to be more meaningful when we're actually playing the scenario and we have an example of that, but just keeping in mind that is how that works. So you basically, when a unit is eliminated, Under certain conditions, like them not being able to escape because they're fully surrounded by the enemy, they would be permanently eliminated, in which case they're not really coming back. Otherwise, they would be awaiting recovery, and then, depending on passing an initiative die roll, they would be able to be recovered, though they do so in a reduced format. So if a unit was eliminated and it aims to come back, I believe, will always do so in a reduced capacity. And when we talk about initiative, for all units, that's going to be that boxed number in the middle. So we would need to roll a 3 or less to successfully recover this cavalry unit. And when it would come back, it, I believe, should be coming back to its reduced side. So that is something we would be doing depending on the turn, early in our turn phase to do that. And then when they do bring units back, and that's considered the next phase as part of reorganization, they would be coming back with a leader. And then that leader is going to have command issues because they're basically using that hour of time to get those units reorganized, which will affect the command status of the rest of the formation potentially. So that is something that, again, it's like I'm describing it. I'm not really talking about each step in the process, but that would make this video maybe a little too long. But just keep in mind that's something you would be doing early in your phase. And then we get to the real meat of this command phase by actually doing the command segment. So what you would do is if you had any out of command markers already on the map, you would remove those because we're going to redetermine the command status of all units on the board. And basically your commander, assuming you have one, and the Austrians do, so do the French in this scenario, they're going to have command points that would place officers and combat units in command. So if we were looking, and I'll zoom in here for us, if we're looking at Coburg here, that number in brackets is a 2. He has 2 command points, which basically means he can, at least in his present spot on the map, he's going to be able to put 2 formations in command, assuming that their officer is within 4 hexes of the commander, right? So we have this officer here, and we have this officer here. Both are, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, within command range of Coburg. So his 2 command points are going to be able to put both of these formations in command. And because the officer is there and the rest of their units in that formation are all within 3 hexes of that officer, basically those formations in their entirety will be in command. So they're all really good to go. Now, there's also formations that are out of range to have command points, and the fact that Coburg doesn't have any command points left if he is in the process of activating those units. So if we went over, let's see if I can get this on camera without causing a snafu with my units. There are some formations over here. There's the 4th column and the 5th column. They are far outside the range of the commander. So if their whole formations are going to activate, or I should say be in command, I shouldn't use the word activate, I'm sorry, then they're going to have to roll initiative. That is how they'll become in command. And so each of those guys have a command rating. So for Charles, that's a 4. For Bulow, that's a 3, which means that's the number that we need to roll or less to be able to activate their formation. So you can see there's a decent chance of both of these folks being in command each. 50% chance, greater than 50% chance. But it may mean that these columns lag behind a little bit. If they are not in command, then that's going to be a problem. If that were the case, we would mark them without a command tokens to remind us that those whole formations, because we tried to do this with the leader, failed. When we're done with the command and we've placed any of the command markers to help us as a mnemonic understand who's in command or out of command, then we're going to go to our movement phase. Um, so during that phase, the player whose turn it is going to be able to move all of their forces that are in command. There's also a thing called a march order, which is basically a written command that says this set of folks are all going to move unless they get interrupted to this town. But we're going to not dig too deeply into that mechanic right now. So we can do movement. So we can move everybody that's in command. Reinforcements, if any, would also come in this time, and they would enter. And we are going to probably have some reinforcements on the second turn of this battle, but not the first, for the coalition. So if I spin my camera back over here, when we get going, these formations will for sure get to move. They will definitely get to do that, and we'll need to figure out what we want to do. The way that the markers are set up here, just to understand it, is the first number is strength, so a 2. Then there's that initiative number, and then the movement points. So obviously a cavalry, not a huge amount of men actually involved here, but they do have a reasonably good movement. Quite good, actually. 7 is pretty high. I think the standard for cavalry tends to be like 6. So these guys can move much farther. The infantry are all going to tend to move 4, and then I think artillery tends to move 4. Yeah. So 4 movement points. We can do this movement in however we want to, in every which way we want to do it. However, we cannot move any out of command formations during this phase. So we're going to move everybody that's in command first, and then we're going to move the folks that are out of command. And what matters there is, let's say we move these guys up, knowing that they're good to go. If I'm risking something by exposing my flank over here, I'm hoping that these guys activate and can move being out of command. There is a thing to adjudicate that. But I don't know for sure that they'll get to, which means I've kind of got to commit these 2 formations before the others maybe get to move, if they move at all. So there's that opportunity of, I guess, a little bit of fog of war. You don't know for sure what's going to happen if you move this main concentration of forces forward. Just to mention again, for those formations that were not in command, when we're done moving all the in-command guys, we're going to roll a die for each out-of-command unit that we want to move, and we're going to use that unit's individual initiative rating for the die roll to see if they move. If they do make it, they can move their full value and everything. But if they don't make the die roll, then they can't move at all. So just, again, something to keep in mind as you're looking to do your movement. Now, movement itself is actually pretty simple, right? We've got the movement points. And yes, for all the terrain on the map, there are different movement rates for the terrain. If you're traveling along the roads, whether that's a minor road, major road kind of thing, or trails, they use the term trails here. So these are trails, these are roads. Generally speaking, a clear hex is 1 movement point. If you're moving along a road, that will be 1 movement point. If it's a trail, that's going to tend to be 1 movement point as long as you're moving through the connections. You might ask, why does it matter if, a trail is in a clear hex, or you have a whole string of clear hexes and the roads? It's also to facilitate road movement, which is basically like column movement. You can say a unit is going to use road movement, in which case it's considered to be in sort of a road, sort of column march formation, and you basically are paying a half a movement point for roads. There are a bunch of restrictions around that. Units can't be adjacent because they're sort of strung out. If they get attacked, that could be problematic. But you can pop out of the sort of road column movement during the movement itself. So you can kind of like go into that formation, move very quickly, come out of it, as long as you spend the movement point to come out of it. So you you're going to have to look at it as you move your units forward. Does it make sense to go in a road formation for some of the journey or not, or just sort of advance and pick the terrain that you want to end up in? Obviously, it's much easier to get through a wood type hex with a trail than not, because if you're just walking through, like, let's see, well, let's say you're not using the trail and you enter this hex, that is 2 movement points for infantry and artillery, and it's actually 4 movement points for cavalry and horse artillery. So of the 2 different unit types, or I guess you could say like movement types, we're not getting that specific in the rules, but if you're cavalry, you may have a different cost to enter certain hexes than infantry, and that may really impact where you decide to move. But movement is really straightforward. You can do something called a repulse as you do movement. You could almost think of this like a bit like an overrun, is the kind of the way that I look at it. But it is a certain type of combat, one that could end up being a bit costly. So I'm probably not going to do a whole lot of repulsing in this scenario, but it is something that is an option. I'm going to check the rulebook here just to make sure I understand the procedure here, because it does cost movement points. So you move up next to a unit, you expend the movement cost of the hex that you're trying to enter that has an enemy in it. And then you can only succeed in a repulse. You have to have, to succeed in a repulse, you have to have 5-to-1 odds or greater based on the strength of the units. And then it's going to force a unit to retreat. So if you're going to move a force forward and it meets a similar size of unit, you're not going to repulse them. You're going to end up in a combat. But just keep in mind, it's something that you can potentially do during the movement phase. You can potentially repulse. So in this case, like with these guys, we could go, 1 and then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all in one move without going in a column. We still aren't going to make it to the French. We'd be close, and they'd be able to move up themselves if they wanted to, maybe try to attack. They retreat before combat, and we've sort of drawn them out of the town or something. So that's the kind of thing you're going to see if the infantry were to move, and let's say they did try to do the road movement. They could maybe get 1, 2, 3, 4 down to here rather than go 1, 2, 3, 4. So that is an option there if we're looking at the second column to advance, but not necessarily something that we would want to do every time, depending on where we're headed. The other part of terrain that matters, obviously, is for combat, which we're going to talk about next. But just keep in mind that when you're moving your units, you will want to put them, in terrain that makes sense during the combat phase, whether that's because you're going to attack or maybe you're not quite to your opponent. Maybe, if we're not going to make it down to this town, but we know that the French may go next and may try to attack us, where would we rather be over here? Would we rather be in the forest? Maybe for some of our units. Would we like to be on the opposite side of a crest? That might matter. Crests kind of allow for shock combat, which we'll talk about here shortly more often. So, we'd want to compare the initiative ratings of our units and see if waiting behind a crest makes sense or not. So, not just in terms of, how are you doing movement, but what really matters there. I should also point out, I just made a mistake. So when you cross a bridge, it's 1 additional movement point. So it's not just a total negation of the river. Like, you still have to pay extra because a bridge is a confined space for your men to move through. The exception would be if they were moving in road march, then they actually get to treat that as no additional movement point cost. So you'd go in road movement 1, 2, so on. But if it were just regular movement, it would be 1, 2 just to get to this hex. So something to think about there, guys, and I'm sure I'll make some minor terrain mistakes along the way in my playthrough. But again, yeah, something to think about. So let's talk about combat next, because that's going to matter a whole lot. Okay, and speaking of combat is not terribly complicated. It is relatively straightforward, but there are a few special things to take note of. Generally speaking, if you're talking about infantry, cavalry units, to be able to attack or be in combat, they do need to be adjacent. So if we just create a fictional situation here, they do need to be adjacent. The exception to that would be artillery, which can fire upon units that are 2 hexes away or 3 hexes away. If they fire at 3 hexes away, they do have a strength, a barraging, bombardment penalty to their strength when 3 hexes away. That's sort of factoring in like distance, accuracy. It's just not as potent as if it were 2 hexes away. When artillery is adjacent, assuming it's maybe stacked with some other units or whatever, they can lend their strength to the combat. So if we just take this French infantry and just say that it's, or French artillery rather, if it was in the same hex, they could attack together. So this could be 8 strength points instead of just 7 because the artillery is combined. So to summarize, artillery can be involved in a normal combat when adjacent to enemies, but also basically can fire the distance. Now, when you're doing actual combat, the basic rule of thumb that you should keep in mind is that every engaged unit has to be involved in a combat. And depending on how the units are aligned, where they're in each other's zocs, they're capable of actually having combat, you need to kind of line up the attacks just so. So, for instance, we have, let's say, this unit here by himself, which would probably be a bad move. He actually has to attack all 3 of the Austrian units here. So the leader, not actually a combat unit, but this infantry, that infantry, and this artillery have to be attacked together, which would be basically 1 to 2 odds, because it would be 7 attacking what is functionally, was that 13? Yeah, 13. Not a great combat. And if we're going to look at the combat results table just to show this, not factoring in any other shifts, it's pretty likely that the attacker is going to retreat. At least 50% of the time, we're going to see a attacker retreat result on the combat odds die roll. So probably not the attack that we want. Now, if we're the Austrians and we find ourselves in that position where we have multiple hexes being able to attack just the one, well, then that's just fine. They'll have, well, it's not quite 2 to 1, so they'll be on the 1.5 to 1 column on that. If you don't have the full odds ratio, you're basically, you don't get to round up. It's always down to the next appropriate column on the combat shift. Now, if there were other units that were nearby, and I'm going to just create something like that, then what more likely you would see is maybe these guys attacking here, this attacking here, because you do have more units nearby. So, and of course I'm going to have to put these guys back to where they belong before we start playing. But in that manufactured scenario, again, it's going to depend on where you're set up, and it would be better probably for the French to be understanding that these guys are not the same division, so that could be a problem. But again, just for the sake of example, it would be better to be like here, so that we're not having to fight these guys, we're just fighting this stack. That would be more appropriate. And so you can kind of see where stacking could eventually become a big issue, where you want to have a decent amount of firepower in 1 hex to fight 1 hex rather than having to be too spread out. And ultimately, your spread out units having to engage some other unit in a nearby hex or in an adjacent hex, having to kind of fight that out. So besides the calculation of strength points for the odds, terrain does have a factor. So probably the most significant thing in the system is that towns, slopes, woods, hexes, crests, when we're fighting over a crest, and basically these are crests here, which are just, not true full elevation shifts, but where a hillside kind of has a crest. A crest in real life. Go touch grass, guys. Yeah, you know what a crest is. Um, so that can have an effect, and what can sometimes happen is it will turn results that are like, just to reuse that same column example, an AR star. This would be an attacker retreat, but in certain terrain, it gets converted into an SK result. An SK result is shock, which is a specialized form of combat where basically you're going to use the shock table and you're going to make a comparison of the two sides' best initiative for the units involved. So an attacker 1 through 7, defender 1 through 7. But you're also going to roll a die. Each player will roll a die, which will add either 0, 1, or 2 to their shock value, which is their modified initiative. Their base initiative modified by the die rolls, which you can see in the modifiers down below. There's a few other modifiers, but then basically this is going to cause either a more specific retreat result, or it's going to cause some step losses, possibly step losses for both sides. And so it is where shock combat actually is your greater chance to see what is functionally step losses on the map. Most regular combat that is not shock based, meaning largely just formations firing their muskets at each other, firing their guns at each other, small arms fire, it's going to forces to retreat. Usually that's usually what that means. They're going to retreat a couple of hexes, ceding ground and position to the attacker or defender or whatever, which could lead to broken up lines, which would then possibly lead to something a little more exciting, like these guys like this, maybe eventually these guys like this, and there are Zocs all around, so that when these guys have to retreat, they go to the units awaiting recovery box, and you functionally knock them out for some period of time. And even if they return, they're going to come back on a reduced step. So that's where, while this game may feel at times to some folks to be maybe not bloody, it's all about where the actual fighting is occurring, and what's the end result. It's not that guys aren't dying when you have a combat die roll and folks retreat. It's just that the engaged number of men isn't necessarily changing very much until you have shock combat, which when we talk about shock, and it goes from not just firing in short range, but ultimately possibly fighting with bayonets, that has the potential to disrupt the organization of the unit, which is what the step losses are functionally doing. When you take a step loss and you flip, the whole organization structure of that, whatever it is, the regiment, the battalion, has become heavily disrupted and may not be able to reconstitute itself to the full, fresh status that it may have had previous. So the combat in this game, is about leveraging that terrain. And because shock combat is a comparison of initiative values, and initiative is sometimes feeling almost like an action rating if we were to compare something to like OCS, units that have a better initiative rating, or maybe more, it is more feasible to succeed to come charging over that crest at an opponent or through the woods at the opponent to disrupt them. But the shock table still provides the capability for a unit with a worse initiative to maybe still luck out and sort of rally and defeat the opponent in that shock combat and force them back or cause them losses, things along that line. There are a number of different modifiers for things. Slopes, streams, bridges all have different potential effects. Things like chateaus, which are these red hex locations, are actually pretty good. They allow the defending infantry strength to be doubled, and to make any defender retreat results turn into shock, which can or cannot be very good depending on what's going on. You also have towns, which are going to cause shock. It also increases defenders by 50%. So if you're looking for, defensive terrain, Towns might be really good. Chateaus is important, or are important. Woods might be good too, but just keep in mind if you're going to be stuck in a situation where your units have crappy initiative, even that kind of terrain that's going to force shock might not be great, because it could mean your guys just can't even hold the ground that they're intending to hold. So it's a tactical thought process, stuff you need to really consider, and think through. Now, there's a few oddball things like retreating before combat that cavalry can do. So, in this circumstance here, where there would be a combat one way or the other, you can basically have the uh, cavalry retreat before combat and simply get away. We see this kind of stuff in other games, other sort of tactical or even operational gunpowder games where the cavalry can just kind of get away, and they can basically be a screening force where these guys are going to have to move. They're going to have to move next to these guys. They're going to want to fight rather than they have to try to fight these guys before maybe chasing some other units, and they just back away. And these guys couldn't have moved further on to do something. So that's definitely a technique with the cavalry we want to use. Even horse artillery can do the retreat before combat. So definitely something at the tactical level, or using the units. Cavalry has a tremendous value in doing that as a screening thing. The other thing that can matter here is to provide a combined arms column shift. So you get a whole column shift for having infantry, artillery, and cavalry involved in an attack, and that can come from either the cavalry being involved in the combat or having performed a charge, which we'll talk about here in a second. So that's the basic combat model. The shock combat we talked about. There are going to be situations where retreating can be problematic. Again, if you retreat into a Zoc, you could be put into the units awaiting recovery box. If you retreat across a bridge, you could actually be eliminated because that's just disruptive to try to retreat through. So there's a case there that you have to watch out for. Advancing after combat, that's going to be like in most games you would see, except that there's certain limitations on who can advance. And again, if you have a stack that's out of command that could advance after combat, they cannot do that. So kind of a bummer for them. The cavalry charges are basically just saying that it's kind of pre-normal combat. If you've moved a cavalry unit up, you're going to perform the charge, cavalry charge. And there are certain restrictions on it. So like terrain can be a big factor, woods, town, anything that isn't allowing the horses to kind of ramp up their speed would affect this. But then charging itself is actually pretty rough. So you work out the ratio and then you roll a die, and you're either going to overrun the opponent, you're going to eliminate your attacking forces, and yeah, it's kind of a funky thing. But what it can do is, if successful, you would have these guys kind of in the defender's hex. So when combat would occur, they would be forced to retreat through a Zoc and potentially be put into the units awaiting recovery box. So charging is basically really high risk. It can get you a lot of benefit, but you could see your cavalry removed. Units that are hit with a charge are going to be put into a square marker, which kind of does some limitations on their movement. But I don't think the penalty for being put in squares is actually that high, honestly. Nothing too crazy. You ideally want to be doing a charge when you have a lot of strength modifiers or a lot of strength in play, so that you're getting more of the like 1-to-1 or 1+1 rather than the 1-to-4, 1-to-3, or 1-to-2, where you're more likely to get rebuffed and not do all the damage that you could conceivably do. For bombardment, this is relatively straightforward stuff. You're going to have your artillery designate who you're going to fire at. You're going to check the line of sight, which the line of sight rules, I'm not going to go through all of it, but basically you want to be at a higher elevation and trace a clear path from the center of the firing hex to the center of the target hex. So pretty well in alignment with most line of sight games at this scale. And then you're going to determine that bombardment strength. If your target has artillery in it, the strength of that artillery will actually affect the strength of your artillery and where they end up on the bombardment table. So the hidden units stuff comes into play a little bit there, where like you're going to put your artillery to cover a unit that you care about because it's going to do the counter battery fire. But if you don't have artillery, then the enemy, then whoever's bombarding you, they're going to do so at the full value. There are effects of terrain, so basically trying to fire into towns or woods or firing from towns or woods will reduce your bombardment strength, and then you're going to roll a die on the bombardment table, and you can see there's different results. Some of them are retreats, some of them are just straight up step losses to the receiving party, which is actually pretty powerful, to be honest. To be able to reduce a unit with bombardment is really strong, right? Because when you think about like reducing, that means a whole step loss. You're functionally doing what is hard to achieve with regular combat. You're achieving it with bombardment, which puts a tremendous strength on getting your artillery in a really good position, and you could basically heavily disrupt the enemy army before they can even properly engage, because once they've been, they've taken a step loss, they're that much easier to fight in conventional combat, and then if you can force them off the map, they're not coming back. They're going to be permanently eliminated at that point. So nothing too crazy. Again, your artillery best used at either as part of a combat, as a natural just strength point add to the combat, or helping to provide combined arms, or bombarding at 2 to 3 hexes away, hopefully doing well enough to straight up reduce a unit. And when you're done with combat, that's basically it. You are done with your turn. You've adjudicated everything, and then it switches over to the second player, who's going to do all the same things. So you definitely want to be thinking about, just to zoom out for a second as we look at the map, if the Austrians are going to move, can they move, forward enough to actually engage the French? If not, where do they move up to, knowing that the French could move forward and engage them? So you have to kind of think through that. And even if you've now engaged in combat or artillery firing or whatever, if you're the first player, what are you leaving the second player for the rest of the turn before it comes back to you, obviously, and whatever the next series of actions are going to be? Does advancing after combat put you in an exposed position? Are you putting the enemy in a position where they just can't respond as well because you disrupted their lines heavily? Then that's good. There's not a mechanism in this game to get like a stolen march necessarily outside of the cards, I think. So, you will go, your opponent will go. You're not going to get a back-to-back turn. It's always going to be kind of the I go, you go, back and forth bit as you play through. The night game turn stuff, which I'll only cover very briefly, is going to be opportunities for units to back out of enemy zones of control, which can be valuable if you need to reshuffle your units around. You're going to have units that are going to recover from the awaiting recovery box. And you can potentially be looking at new march orders. Again, we talked about march orders. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time digging too deep into those. That's kind of a really specialized topic. So the only other thing to mention, there are improved positions which provide defensive bonuses to units as well. So somewhat similar to Chateaus, but slightly different. You can build those. They just take some time, and it may take a while because it's die roll based to build them. Okay. So all that said, when we talk about the actual operational mechanics of the game, they're not too difficult, right? These are all really relatively straightforward mechanics. You have movement. Movement is based around terrain. You want to be in command so you can have reasonable expectation that you're moving. You can get caught out if units that are not in the immediate vicinity of your commander don't activate properly or don't get in command properly. They could either not show up at all or kind of be in a bad situation anyway. And then combat is it's odds based, generally speaking, and there are a few special things you can do with cavalry and artillery that feel about appropriate for the era. Terrain having a heavy influence over all of those things, which we have plenty of terrain bits here to concern ourselves with. Okay, so from here, I'm going to put the units back to where they're supposed to be for setup, and we'll talk a little bit about the strategic implications of all of this. Okay, so let's talk strategy, how all this comes together. The way to calculate victory will basically be counting victory points. Now, we're going to get victory points as either side for eliminating units causing demoralization against formations, all that kind of good stuff. So generally let's hurt the opponent. And I don't know that requires any special strategy input other than, if you can create those circumstances where you're flanking a unit and being able to get in behind them and force them off the map, that's obviously going to be a pretty key way tactically to achieve some level of victory. The bits on the map tell kind of a different story. So the coalition, Austria, they start the scenario in control of functionally 15 victory points worth of stuff. So if nothing changes, if the two armies sat here and did nothing and did not move to advance, the coalition would have 15 victory points. The French would have, I believe it's 20. So there are victory points here, which are being treated worth 5 in this scenario. So if the French hold and don't get forced off the map, or they don't get totally beat down, are going to end up with 20 victory points for that. So if nothing else, if the map stays totally the same, the French will technically be ahead in victory points. Now, whether or not that's enough for a true victory, let me double check the day of battle adjudication here. So if it were 20-5, or 20-15 rather, that actually might be considered that would be a French marginal victory. Okay, so yeah, that would be a French marginal victory if nothing were to change. So the onus of moving forward and attacking is on the coalition. They will need a move to attack, which is what happened historically. And the historical narrative would be the French kind of eventually falling back here and roughly here. Might get some hexes wrong. And fending off the coalition enough that by all is said and done, both armies are kind of battered and beaten, and then strategically, the coalition army basically retreats away. Now, I don't know if that would be considered a general retreat in game terms. That's something more that we didn't really cover in the straight up mechanics stuff, but basically you say, hey, my whole army's going to retreat, and all your units are running off to a hex location, usually serving as a supply source that is an exit point. And you will get some level of victory points for keeping your guys alive. I think it's like every 5 units you get a victory point for each baggage train. That's worth 4 victory points. So you can actually get a pretty good grab of victory points by doing that. But I think if the coalition were to just say right off the bat, we're going to retreat right now off the map, they probably would not get enough victory points to win, because they'd probably get caught up somewhere. So I don't know how you want to look at that. This is one of those gamey questions. Do you just do a general retreat right away and see how many victory points you can get? what happens there? There's probably some consequence to that, and again, I would expect uh, the victory points to probably come out in the French favor. They're probably catching some people on the retreat out. There's probably some penalties for doing that. So we're certainly going to have to make something happen, have an actual attempt at an attack, and um, work that out for the coalition. Yeah, okay. So yeah, the restriction on the general retreat, I had to double check on the rules. You're limited by the number of eliminated units. So if the Austrians try to cut and run here at the beginning of the scenario and just try to get out of Dodge, um, that is obviously a loss. I was trying to make sure, I'm like, surely there's no way I can simply retreat my army and win. And that's the case. You only get as many victory points as you get for retreating off the map, basically based on the number of eliminated enemy units. So it could be the Austrians can swoop in, utterly wreck the French army, and then could potentially retreat off the map and get some victory points that way. But I guess that all remains to be seen. I think the important thing is we have a real fight of it. So I think we'll just, for our own purposes, we'll ensure that the Austrians aren't going to do something too sneaky. They're going to try to come. They're going to try to defeat the French. They're going to try to take Charleroi back, and we'll go from there. But let's figure out kind of what that is really going to look like. Okay, so let's say we're going to shoot for some victory points. We definitely would like to demoralize our enemy as much as we conceivably can. The reality will be that most formations on either side will probably become demoralized either from demoralization rating 6 to 8 or a little bit higher than that for some of the French formations. And just to show what that looks like, here are the casualty tracks. So we'll zoom in for a second on the coalition. So if we're talking about the Battle of Fleurus, let's use the second Austrian. This is the demoralization marker for that formation. If we start losing units, they become eliminated and are put in either into the awaiting recovery box, or they're permanently eliminated. The strength value of the counter, so let's just, for fun, we'll just grab one and say he's in that formation. Strength of 5. If that unit is completely eliminated, we would end up on the 5 spot. 5 strength points have been eliminated. If we were to then lose, say, like a cavalry, that's a couple more, we would reach 6 or 7, which, once we're beyond this number, will lead to that formation becoming demoralized. The effects of demoralization are a number of minor penalties to things like initiative, the ability to advance after combat. Probably most critically is the die roll potential, however slim. I think it's like 33%, something like that. That's a good look. During the reorganization phase, a demoralized formation for a unit, each unit you have to roll a die. If it's a 5 or a 6, that unit is permanently eliminated. So if you can drive a formation to demoralization, you'll get some victory points for that, so we'll certainly want to do that. But it could also lead to the collapse of that formation, the rest of the units basically bowing out. So when we talk about turning the way that the combat system works and all the tactics and stuff to victory on the field, what could be valuable is to target really strong units in a formation and cause that to fail. So, if we were to go look at that actual formation that would become demoralized at 6, that means that at least one of their infantry units, which is worth 5 strength points, plus one other unit, whether that's cavalry, maybe the artillery, or both infantry, if basically two units, one of them being one of the infantry in that formation, becomes demoralized, then, or I'm sorry, gets eliminated, then that whole formation of the second column becomes demoralized and will then be in real deep trouble. So I think given the scarcity of units, if you're able to knock out that many forces, that formation's probably screwed anyway. So I don't think we need to worry too much on either side about, like, I don't know, getting caught out too badly, but we do need to watch out if there's an exposed unit that is very strong, that it could tip the scales of that formation being demoralized. So each formation on the map, we're going to have to take special precaution to make sure that they're not too exposed as we advance, that the cavalry are protecting the flanks. If we were to lose the cavalry, well, that would suck. Maybe you'd rather lose a cavalry than a core part of the infantry that would lead to the whole formation falling apart. So something we need to watch out for, something we do need to consider. The other thing, as we look at the map, is if we can get into Charleroi as the Austrians, then that's great. But what will happen is if the French can get a unit inside one of these three hexes, basically nobody can attack or disrupt this fortress, basically, due to these jagged lines. The one interesting thing is the bridge right here is considered destroyed. It's not there. So if you get a unit into Charleroi, you basically are safe there. However, if the Austrians are actually able to progress down here enough to cut this road, this road, this road, and that unit can't trace supply, you treat an out of supply unit as being demoralized, which means basically every time we would be checking for that during reorganization, it's possible that that unit isolated in Charleroi could actually be eliminated due to that. So technically, yes, Charleroi, while you can't attack it, you don't in the course of the battle, you don't have enough forces to assault the fortifications. You can technically isolate the fortress and knock them sort of out of supply and potentially have them surrender, is how I would interpret that. Now, supply is going to be checked on certain turns, basically 6 a.m., 9 a.m., noon, 3 p.m., and then 6 p.m. During the recovery. They're listed on the turn track with a recovery statement or a line that says recovery. That is when we do check supply in this battle. So maybe I mentioned in the last video where supply wouldn't be that much of a concern. It is a concern. It's just going to depend on how things work out. So if you're out of supply, it's like being demoralized. Being demoralized and out of supply at the same time. Don't stack. And to make sure you're in supply, you basically are going to count 14 hexes from a unit to your baggage train. 14 hexes. They have to start up within 7. So for a lot of these guys, we might be moving the baggage train back. But so long as it's 14 away, so like here, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, 13, 14, we could move this baggage train back to here after the during the French movement, we can pull it back. So it's 14 hexes from the unit to the baggage train, and then or a supply source, but you'd have to be really far back for that to be true. And then from the baggage train back to the supply hex is an unlimited number of road and trails. So as long as this guy can trace somewhere, it isn't totally cut off. So yeah, you could get into your enemy's backfield and disrupt their supply lines and put them into deep trouble that way. And then they're running the risk of surrendering or falling apart because they don't have access to a home base. They don't have access to their baggage train. That's demoralizing. Definitely something that's going to play into it. So eliminating units, we can get some victory points. If we can demoralize units, that will get us some victory points. So yeah, we're going to get a certain number of victory points based on a differential of combat strength points removed. So that combat or that victory point calculation is based on the size and strength of the units eliminated. So certainly get more victory points ultimately if we're eliminating a lot of those big infantry units. And then on the backside, we're going to get victory points for demoralizing those formations, which again will be happening because of the elimination of those big units. If we can snag a baggage train, that will get us a few victory points. And then we've talked about the places on the map that are worth holding for victory points. So all of that is generally straightforward in terms of how do these other aspects that are in the rules that are not technically part of the sequence of play going to affect what we do. All right, let's conclude this by focusing on actual efforts. So if we start with the fifth column over here is the Austrians, it definitely makes sense that they should be trying to move at the very least into this town chateau structures here. So there's a town here. It's probably not super easy to see, but there is just south of their position forests, chateaus, towns that if these guys could move up and can hold here and then maybe use their cavalry actually to go like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They could be threatening to kind of swing down and around and target the right wing's baggage train off camera further south here. So at the very least, it certainly makes sense that these guys should be moving probably as they can to get into some of this terrain here, which would be valuable for them to hold when the French go and maybe try to counterattack. So if they can move up, get into a position here of relative safety, that certainly makes a lot of sense. For the fourth column, they kind of have to be careful because they could advance into Fleurus. Probably they ought to, but they're going to need to make sure they don't get flanked by what could happen is these guys could go west, these guys could go east, and could try to wrap up around this whole formation potentially. So we're going to need to watch the flank, maybe coast this guy over here, have these guys move into the town and get into defensive terrain, and hope that these guys come as well. And I suppose it's going to depend on if they activate and move or not, and that's going to be the tricky part. If these guys can all sort of activate and move forward, but these guys don't, they could find themselves in a real exposed position. So there's a part of me that wonders, do they move at all? But if they do move, I think they move to get into some kind of line that they can hold while the fifth column arrives from the east. Further west, I generally think these guys should make a move forward and should probably make up some kind of play down here or provide support to the fourth column. So third definitely should be heading south. Maybe leverage the crest and provide support here. And the second column should probably advance far enough that they're threatening, but we may want to pause because they're kind of the end of the Austrian line for the moment, and we don't want to get cut off here. Not that the left wing of the French have a lot of capability to move around. We do want to watch out for things like the horse-drawn artillery here that could sweep out around these guys. So we don't want to expose them. We want to advance, but we want to advance without too much exposure until we can maybe get some reinforcements. Because when the Dutch come in, they are going to start to pressure here. So the concern of the flank move here will start to go away. This whole left wing is kind of spread out and susceptible that they're probably going to need to retract back to this set of towns over here and maybe get some defenses behind these streams, such that we don't get a crossing too far. They don't get flanked around, or they don't lose this crossing at the river, which would be very painful to lose at this point, because if you lose this river crossing, the next closest one is all the way over here, and even that's not a bridge. I think that's considered a what do you call that? I'm forgetting the game term. I apologize. But there's a crossing here, but it's not a good crossing. And then otherwise you have to go even further over here. So I think that the main thing that the left wing of the French are going to have to do is pull back and try to make sure they don't lose the river crossing over here, while the Dutch on the Austrian side are certainly going to try to come down to do that. So for sure, I think the overall situation is the Austrians are going to cautiously advance. They're going to look for opportunities to get in behind the French before the French can go. But to do that really requires fortunate command eye rolls on their left, which are not guaranteed. Otherwise, we'll certainly end up having some fighting somewhere through here, I expect. For the French, I think they definitely need to be pulling back their baggage trains to more secure locations, and then the best they can hope for is to get into that sort of arc shape, defensive arc from here through here to this bend in the river. If they can create something of a mutually supporting line of defense, they can probably hold and look to do local counterattacks, assuming they've managed to hold on, or they can get good shots off at the Austrians with their artillery. They would really be looking for an opportunity to pounce on exposed Austrian units and maybe give them the chance to demoralize the Austrians such that they can't penetrate the defensive line. They're bouncing away, maybe bouncing back into open terrain after being forced to retreat, and then can get beat up by combined attacks or concentric attacks or cavalry charges with combined arms. Who knows what? But I think those are the basic ideas that the sides are going to pursue. Cautious advance on the Austrians, French retreat into defensive positions with counter punching where they can, and the rest will be for the dice to decide, I suppose. Again, without the hidden unit stuff, I mean, I could try to do that, and then I start to forget what the strengths are of units, but that playing it double blind like that just seems a little weird solitaire, so I'm just going to have to make it work, guys. Anyway, I hope this video was somewhat helpful, at least kind of explaining how things ought to operate together. The rules are not terribly complicated. There's only so many learn to play videos out there. I still don't know that I would consider this a full, really good how to play video, but it's all the things that factor into the way that this battle is gonna start and operate here in the rest of the video series. So we will see you in the next video, which really should be turn one of the battle, and we'll go from there. So thanks for watching, guys. Hope this was enjoyable for you, and you appreciate the nuances that I'm adapting myself to play this system and to play this specific battle. We'll see you in the next one. Take care. Keep on gaming.